YouTube as we come together for the next to last edition of the Wednesday class that shall not be named for 2023. We will have class next week, but the week after I'm going to be out of town doing an Indian Jewish wedding in New Orleans. So that's pretty exciting. Welcome to everybody who is on our call here on Zoom. So welcome to Stuart and Karen and Lou and Arlene and Ron and Carol and Larry and anybody else who is here who I cannot see. We have had an exciting run of Maimonides, and we're going to finish it off today as we're going to look at his Mishneh Torah last week, and you can find the class on YouTube. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze 1 second. Okay, it went away. No, it's coming back. Last week we talked about the Guide to the Perplexed, which was, again, excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry about that, which was the Guide to Perplexed was his most controversial piece of work, although he had already established himself as a leader in so many ways. The work we're going to talk about today in more detail, the Mishneh Torah, was also controversial. As we know, he was very controversial in many ways, even though he was pretty much the leader of the Jewish community in Egypt and one of the great Jewish leaders in the world. But this one was also controversial, and we'll talk a little bit about what's it about. We'll talk about its controversy. We'll talk about and a variety of other things that have to do with it. But as we know, he was, no matter what we talk about him, we still have to, he is maybe the greatest Jewish scholar of all time. And so what we have to do is acknowledge that he today is not controversial at all. So today, not controversial. It's been 800 years. But in his day, he was very controversial for many reasons. And we'll talk about someone. Of course, he's Sephardic, so controversial Ashkenazic. Controversial because some people like to get their name in the press, as we know. But there were some legitimate reasons for him to be so controversial. And there were some other reasons beyond what we'll talk about. But again, nobody during his age doubted his intellect. I mean, it wasn't like he's a moron, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That was certainly not the case. He was probably the most well-known Jewish person of the age, and everybody knew how brilliant he was. So it wasn't that kind of, so let's just briefly go a little bit more about him personally, and then we'll go into the Mishneh Torah. I know we talked about him already. Lived in the 12th century, died just at the beginning of the 13th century. He was, again, born in Spain towards the end of the first round of the Golden Age of Spain. It was during a very difficult period for Jews in Spain, so he left, moved to Israel. He and his family were well-to-do. Israel was the middle, although the Holy Land, it was nothing there. It was a desert and it was swampland. It was hard to make a living, so they ended up in Egypt, which of course was a very prominent area at that time period. Remember, the Muslim world is still probably the most educated place on earth. He is going to be a sage, scholar, and then his brother dies. And his brother was the person who was financing him with the family business. With that gone, he had to find his own way to support himself, so he became a physician. Not only a physician, because obviously when you're the best at everything, he became the physician to the Sultan. He consulted with leaders and kings and such forth in Europe. And so in the outside Jewish world, he was famous for being a top-notch physician and a philosopher. In the Jewish world, he was known as a great intellect, as a Talmudic scholar, and as a philosopher. And he was very smart because his magnum opus, as he called it, was the Mishneh Torah. That's the additional teaching of the Torah, the review of the Torah, however you want Mishneh. There's a lot of different ways to define it. And the Guide to the Perplexed, the philosophical work, wrote after the Mishneh Torah. As we talked about, if he had done the Guide to the Perplexed first, he would have been in many ways considered a heretic. But since he had already done the Mishneh Torah, and did the Guide to Perplex afterwards. Everybody knew he was a Talmudic scholar. It was okay. A lot of people don't realize there are a lot of his works that have been lost through the ages. He did a lot of work on the Mishnah, and it is gone. For some reason, it was never found. If it's ever found, obviously, it will be a great find. But the Mishnah Torah we do have, and we're going to go over that today. This is his Talmudic, his halachic, his magnum opus. He called it his Hibur HaGadol, which is basically the magnum opus, his great work. And it took him, by his own account, maybe 10 years to write it. Now remember, he's also a physician during this time. He's also the Jewish leader of Egypt. He's also traveling as a physician. So he is very, very busy. He's a busy, busy man. And I don't know where he found time to sleep. So when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he did something that nobody had ever even probably tried. If they had, we haven't heard of it, so they failed completely. He tried to codify the entire Talmud. He tried to codify the Talmud. Now I'm going to take this for you guys to see. You guys see the very back there, my bookcase. On top of the bookcase behind the Star Wars stuff, you see those books. That's the Talmud. Not each book is not the same. All are different. So that is a complete set of Talmud in English and in Hebrew. It is really long. Not only that, he had additional pieces of the Talmud that no longer exist. They believe that he had some other pieces of the Talmud that have been lost through the age. So it is a big work. I mean, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's probably 50 volumes right there. Of course, it's in Hebrew and in English. I mean, Aramaic, Hebrew, and English. So he just did the Aramaic and Hebrew version. And so he took that and tried to create a set of codification for what he called the layman in many terms. So what does that mean? He believed that he was bringing all of Jewish knowledge into one place, all the trials, all the tribulations, all the scholars, everything into one series of books that everybody could read, that was accessible to everyone. And that was a major accomplishment, even to attempt it is a major accomplishment. To complete it, that's amazing. He's trying to bring the law to everybody. You know, to read and study the Talmud takes weeks, and nobody has a whole thing of the Talmud. Obviously he did, but he was rare. And he tried to do it in a way that would bring it to everybody. And it is an incredible attempt. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about it. He believed that now where it comes into complications are in 2 or 3 areas. One, he believed it was all inclusive and that this was the only book you really needed. Like, you could not read the Talmud, you could just read the Mishnah Torah. Now, can you imagine saying that? This is all you need. Don't worry about the Talmud. Just read this. Now, he was also, of course, talking to the laity, not to the scholars, but he said, this is all you need to read to know about Judaism. And that is, of course, very controversial. If you say, this is all you need, then obviously not everybody's going to be happy with you. So that was the biggest controversy, is his belief that this is all you needed in the Jewish world was this book itself. That it draws from the Bible, the Talmud, the Gaonic sources, the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud. And if you read this, it has all the laws. And so basically think about all of the discussion that's in the Talmud. He just took out what is the actual law that the rabbis determined for this. and he put it all together. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Lou has a question.
Larry, and then Ron.
No, I don't.
Okay, then Lou and then Larry.
So is it like the Cliff Notes of the Talmud?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, very much so.
Okay.
And that is probably the best way to explain it. Now, it's not the Cliff Notes, but it's where you're explaining the major things. But yes, these are the major parts of the Talmud. Exactly.
Okay.
And that's I'm going to use that and not give you any credit for it, Lou, in
That's
the
fine.
future.
You've done that before.
I've done it a lot to a lot of people. Larry.
Yeah, just to follow up on that question as well. You showed us a whole bookcase full of Mishnah of the Talmud. How big is the Mishnah Torah?
It's only a couple. I
Volume?
mean, it's 14 sections. It just depends how big the book is. It can be actually in one book. It can be in a series.
But it's a fraction.
It's a fraction. Oh, yeah.
1,000th, 1/10 of the.
Oh, less than that. Yeah. So
I know you'll get into it, but how many categories did he finally end up with?
we're going to go over that. There's 14 categories, and we'll
Right.
go over that in a second. But 14 categories now, and that's a good point. He categorized it in a different fashion, a more specific fashion than the Talmud. The Talmud has 6 sections, 6 big sections, but he took all of them and he put it into 14 sections using a couple of the names from the Talmud, and we'll go over them section by section in a moment.
Okay.
But I want to make sure I get any other questions before we continue. Carolyn, you're on mute, just to let you know. If you go to the left bottom where it says mute, just click on that. There you go, perfect.
Is this better?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. I have to admit, I'm still thinking about last week. Larry knows that.
Yeah, the last week, I mean, the Guide to the Perplexed is a philosophical giant. That's a lot. This is a little easier to comprehend than that one. I agree with you.
No, but I was fascinated by last week, just fascinated. And
Okay.
I wonder, how do Orthodox people feel about the interpretation? Or I guess it wasn't your interpretation, you were just telling us what Maimonides said about the Bible. And it seems to me that anyone who takes the Bible literally would find it very hard to stomach what Maimonides had to say.
Well, you have to remember a couple things. One, the Mishneh Torah today is a universally acclaimed work. It's not controversial today, the Mishneh Torah. Well, look at the other controversy. They feel that there's some gaps in it, but it's really, and there's there's 2 other compositions that come later. His Guide to the Perplexed is still very controversial in certain circles. Now, you got to remember, in the Orthodox world, the Bible is not always looked at as literal. There's more Jews who look at the Bible literally today than there was 1,000 years ago. I mean, some of the ultra-Orthodox have gone backwards in their view. So the ultra-Orthodox that don't believe in science, they will ignore the Guide to the Perplexed entirely. It's just not part of their world. Orthodox who look at the Bible as kind of as there are literal, there's allegory, metaphor, they will look at it. It just depends. There's not one Orthodox world. But the Mishneh Torah is definitely a very widely studied piece, whereas the Guide to the Perplexed, if you're in that world where you take the Bible literally, you probably don't even know it exists.
Thank you.
But again, there are more probably Jews who take the ultra-Orthodox today take the Bible more literally than they probably did 1,000 years ago, which is ironic in many ways considering science, but they've really enclosed themselves and believe that science and all of these things will take their people away, and so they cannot let them have access to it. So, but that's an excellent question.
What did the Christian world have to say about his, just getting back to the Guide to the Perplexed, the allegories and things like that? Did they comment on it at all?
I don't think, I mean, the Christian world is still coming out of the end of the Dark Ages, really. So they're probably, it's written in Hebrew. The Guide to Perplexed was written in, a Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic dialect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they probably don't really have access. If you're outside the Jewish world, and he's a well-known scholar and doctor. So in the Christian world, he may have been known as a doctor. But remember, they're just starting to read Greek philosophy again in the Christian world, where in the Muslim world it's been continuously. So it would be very strange, I think, until you really live in a world where you have access to Greek thought. If you've never heard of Aristotle or Socrates, or you consider them heretical, then you're not going to be reading the Guide to the Perplexed.
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking back to like plays like Inherit the Wind, where you see these very fundamentalist Christians who believe, the earth was created in 6 days,
Right.
and all of those arguments that he would have been a heretic really in the Christian world.
Yeah, I don't think the Christian world, he was even a part of it at all. I doubt they even knew his name. I mean, they may have known his name as a doctor, because he did do some treatment. He did do some traveling and do some treatment of people. But, his work was not for that world.
Did the Muslims chime in on it? Did they have any comments on it? Well, since he lived in Egypt.
That is a good question. Now, the Muslims at the time were very educated, so they probably wouldn't have had so many problems with the Bible being considered that way, because the Bible, although part of the religion, wasn't the main part of the religion. Now, if he had said something about that, the Quran, that might have been a little bit more problematic, but he doesn't. So I don't think there may have been some issues, but I'd have to look into it. I don't think there was any issues. He was a renowned doctor, philosopher, very respected, in a world where Jews were, in Egypt at least, where Jews were given a lot of respect and a lot of access. So, but you're right. If that had been he would not have done this in the Christian world. I mean, it just would not have been done. I mean, you don't see in the Jewish world, the Jews who are living the Christian world at this point are not talking about science in their studies. It is just not part of it. Rashi does a little bit, but it's really not the same way, because he's in a world where he has access to technology, and the Jews living in the Christian world don't. And so, it's just a different way. It gave him a lot more freedom to be expansive. So if you're Jewish in the Christian world and you're reading this is mind-blowing stuff, especially the Guide to the Perplexed, because you don't have access to Aristotle, Socrates, Greek thought, but you do have access to Philo, Jewish thinkers from the Greek times. You have access to history by Josephus, access to the Geonim, who are living in the Muslim world. So the Jewish world is much more educated probably that way than the Christian world still, and will be for a little bit while longer.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I just want, because in thinking about this, wasn't the Christian world much, well, like you just said, high or very low literacy rates?
Yeah, very low at this time.
In those days. Because I remember
yeah.
learning when we were in France and the papacy had moved to Avignon, the Pope wanted the Jews to stay there because they were so literate.
Right.
And
in most places in the Christian world,
Yeah.
the Jews, literacy was still so minute. It would have been limited to the clergy and maybe some of the upper class, but it would have been limited to what on a need-to-know basis. Like, I need to know how to read for my business. Reading at this level, now you would read maybe for like a comedy play a little bit here and there, but usually you'd go to a play. So they had that kind of stuff a little bit, but no, it was not encouraged. And remember, literacy rates were really low until the 20th century in a lot of places. The Jewish world is the only place where men and women were literate on a whole. It's probably the only place. Larry.
Can I just add one thing?
Oh, sure, please, Karen. Sorry.
And again, this is sort of so much of the art in those days, up until the Renaissance, was religious art, and I think it was intended to use it. They intended to use it to educate people about Christianity because they weren't literate, and so they could use art to convey those teachings.
And that's exactly the case. I mean, art was very limited in the Jewish world because of some of our own.
Right.
We're not allowed to show God, but
Right.
it's also was very limited because exactly what you said, the Christian world used it for education. They didn't want Jewish artists taking people away. People heard the Bible in Latin from their priests. And they had very little other, I mean, they go to plays and stuff, but they, unless you needed it for your job, you probably were not going to be literate. Even if you were a wealthy person or aristocracy, you might not be literate. The Jewish world was literate all the way back, we believe, to the 7th or 6th century BCE.
Wow.
So women were very literate in the Jewish world. They weren't always allowed to study the text, but they were literate, and they would develop eventually their own type of literature that we still have access to today. So, but the Muslim world was literate. I don't know if women were, but the Muslim world was very literate. Larry.
Yeah, just to go back in context, this was around the time of the Crusades, right?
Exactly, and that is a very
the
good
world was
point.
really in turmoil as far as recapturing the Holy Land and
Right.
the Christian Muslim beliefs, and I mean, it was a time to when he wrote this, I mean, that was also quite a turmoil going on.
And the Crusades directly affected him. The entire reason they left Spain was because various kingdoms in Spain, the Muslims were fighting off the encroaching Christians, many of whom were doing the Crusades. And so they hired these marauders from North Africa, Muslim marauders, to come and help defend them. And this group of Muslims did not like Jews. And they ended up taking over the area of Spain for a while. And that's why he left, because this group had taken over Spain. And so Jews were not as accepted for a short period of time during this period. When they are actually overthrown, then Jews are welcome, and then it goes back. So, but it directly affected them. The Dark Ages, the Crusades, the Christian world is not a place Christians today would want to live either. Nobody would want to live in that way. It was very, people didn't take showers. There was disease everywhere. If you were doing things you shouldn't, you could be killed for it. If you caught reading things you shouldn't, it's not a good time to be in that world. That's why I chose to be born during the 20th century. Stuart, and you are on mute.
Okay, thank you. In reference to Aristotle in the Christian world, right after the time of Maimonides, there was a change that was very significant. And that was
Yes.
Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas essentially was an Aristotelian and published a lot of it. And because of that, and because the church was so stagnant at the time, essentially what happened is the church more or less quantified or sanctified almost Aristotle. So any speech against Aristotle became speech against the church, because the church accepted so fully what Aquinas had been saying. The church, I don't think, had understanding of Aristotelian thought, which would have been very anti-church anyway. But the church, and in those years, never really thought about that kind of stuff. This is the dogma, and the dogma is the dogma. So right after Aquinas in this mid to late 13th century, Aristotle actually became dogma in the church for a while.
Exactly. And Thomas Aquinas was very familiar with Maimonides.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is, he's born 20 years-ish after Maimonides dies. So he will be probably one of the most important people to bring Greek thought to the Christian world and helped change the Christian world and send it in a different direction. He is not born yet. He is not, so we're still in the Crusades, as Larry said. We're still in the Dark Ages, Middle Ages. We're coming out of it. But Aquinas is maybe the most important individual to bring him out of it. So people like him are familiar, but of course he was part of the church. He was a sage in the church before he started having these viewpoints. And there were sections of Europe that had access. I think Ireland was a very good example. Certain Irish Christian clergy secretly had Aristotle and they had Greek thought, and they would eventually start passing it. And then the Christians after Aquinas would start going to visit the Muslim world and start learning about this stuff. And then, of course, what we know is what happened is the Muslims were the highest, most intellectual group in the world. The Christians were one of the lowest. And then the pendulum would swing the entire other way as the Muslim world became very insulated, very religious, and the Christian world started to look at Greek thought and started to use that to create their own thought, and then they create democracy and education. And so at this time period, today, the Western world is the most educated, along with some parts of Asia, and the Muslim world has become the least educated, lower than anywhere else in the world. So the Muslim world has the lowest literacy rate, I believe, in the world. Yes, Ron, and then Stuart, let's finish and then go to Ron.
When I was
I'll go Ron first.
docing, I led a tour of teachers and students from Paterson, New Jersey. And I asked her about her students, and she says the big percentage of her students are Muslims. So I said to her, what kind of students are they? And you know what she said? They're all A's and B's, and their parents demand it.
And where do they live?
Patterson, New Jersey.
Right, and that's what
bogus.
America does. You come to America, you come to the West. Now, in certain parts of the Muslim world are very educated. Iran, certain parts of Saudi Arabia, obviously they have a lot of money, so they send people other places to study. But yes, if you have money in the Muslim world, where are you sending your kids for school?
United States.
United States, Europe, Japan. Well, Japan doesn't allow them, the Asia. So so some parts of it, but again, in areas like the Middle East or North Africa or the Philippines that don't have access to oil and you have repressive governments, do you want your students educated? Do you want your people educated? No, you probably don't. Education is not a priority because education leads to knowledge and leads to rebellion, and you want stuff and you want your rights and you want access. So the North Africa, the Middle East, Philippines, the places where there are lots of Muslims that are run by Muslim countries tend to be very lower educated, but there are a lot of Muslims in India that are much more educated. There are Muslims in Europe that are much more, and then of course in America, they're going to be more educated. So it's generally in countries where the Muslims have dictatorships, which is every Muslim country except for Turkey, which is kind of close to it anyway right now. So, but there's a lot of Muslims. There's 2 billion of them almost. So obviously there's going to be educated ones, and but the mass living in these countries are not educated to the level of us. Stuart.
Just a quick note on your mention of the effect of the Irish at this time, and in the sense of saving the intellect of the church, I would recommend strongly a book by Thomas Cahill. Cahill is the guy who wrote The Gifts of the Jews, but he also wrote a book, most of the title I remember, is How the Irish Saved And I'm not sure whether we saved the world or saved the church.
I think it's How the Irish Saved Civilization. I read the book. as
Yeah,
well.
okay. Third option. And that really talks about the whole nature of their role in the church at this time, something that really gets overlooked today
Yeah.
by the church, I think.
Well, and again, this is the world of 900, 800 years ago. So Maimonides, though, he wanted to be a scholar, only a scholar. Who knows what he would have done if he hadn't gone to work? But then again, his work life may have really impacted, what he wrote about. So he writes this text. He says himself that it's more accurate than the Talmud. So again, now the other major critique which is even more, it's really the critique that led this book to not being as important as it could be. Because what's going to happen, he codifies the Talmud. Another guy does the same thing a few years later. And it's called the Torah, the 4 sections basically. So he tries to do the same thing that Maimonides does, fixing the biggest weakness. Now remember, as soon as the Mishneh Torah went out, it went everywhere. I mean, they're reading it in China, in Europe. I mean, this is Maimonides' great work. He's already very well known, so it goes everywhere. So it's very popular. A lot of critics. The biggest critique is going to be he doesn't cite anything. He doesn't cite where he finds in the Talmud or the Mishnah. He doesn't cite the author. He doesn't cite the rabbis who say it. He just says this is the law. And so that is a very big critique, because he also takes liberty and uses his own opinion in certain areas as well. And so think about what your professor in college would have done with your paper if you didn't cite sources. What would you have gotten? An F. Because you have to cite sources. And he felt like he didn't need to for many reasons after the critique. So the irony is later on people would put the citations back, which is specifically what he didn't want. But because he didn't put those citations, another brilliant scholar named Jacob ben Asher will write something called the Tur or the Arba Turim. And that will be a very prominent code book. But then, of course, the major code book will be written years later by a man named Joseph Caro in Sfat, and he will write the Shulchan Aruch, which is the major, almost canonical book. So he brings the Talmud into his book, Joseph Caro. We can talk about it. That is the major code book today. So if you're going to look at the major code book, what everybody reads, it's the Shulchan Aruch. That is what everybody uses. But Maimonides is the first one to try it, and he does it very early on. And so obviously it's a work of genius, and it's studied and he is venerated, Maimonides. But if you're going to say what the book that everybody uses, it's the Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro, written in the 16th century. If you've been to Israel and you've gone to Sfat, I guarantee you've been to the place he wrote it in a synagogue. It is, that's the number one place people go to in Sfat, is to his synagogue where he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. It's impressive. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, Larry, please.
Is there anything in our service, or any of the services, the traditional Saturday morning or even Friday evening services that goes into in the prayer books or anything? Has any of that ever been incorporated?
There's a little reference. Remember, the prayer book is specifically not characterized as a book of study. So that's why one is study, one is prayer. There's a separation. So you don't see the prayer book based on the Talmud or the Shulchan Aruch. There's a couple pieces here and there, but they're not. No, it's not something, because again, when you're praying to God. When you're looking at the Shulchan Aruch, you're studying it or deciding what you're going to do to use it. So it's a very different mode. So no, it's not. I mean, there's sections obviously referenced and stuff for special holidays, but not really. Not like the prayers. And the prayers we have in many cases predate it. But it is the major book. So what we're going to do though is we're not looking at the Shulchan Aruch today. Today we're going to look at the Mishnah Torah. So we're going to actually go on. You can get it for free now in English. If you go here, sefaria.org, can everybody see? Everybody see? So if you look up here, sefaria.org. If you just go there and you go Mishnah Torah, they will have it in English and in Hebrew. All right, and we're going to go over it in just a second. So I showed it to you there. Down to this. Stop share. There we go. So we're going to look at it in a second. So he put it into 14 sections to make it easier for people to understand. The Torah and the Shulchan Aruch are only in 4 sections. They make it easier. So the 4 sections are knowledge, love of God, times in terms of like when is Shabbat. Love of God would be like tzitzit, putting on the tefillin probably. Knowledge would be about like the general knowledge of against idolatry, proper behavior. The ketubah is a section which obviously is on marriage. Kedusha, which means holiness, which has to do with like kashrut. There's one called separation, which is like laws of donations to the temple, oaths, and that kind of stuff. One is zerim, which is seeds, which is obviously tithings and agricultural stuff, and what you do for the sabbatical year, which is ironic because by this time Jews didn't have land. One is about the temple. So even though this is a practical book, there's sections that are about the Holy Temple, what you do at the Holy Temple, but the Holy Temple doesn't exist anymore, so these rules don't really apply, but he still put them in there. Offerings, what kind of sacrifices to make to God. Now, they're not doing sacrifices anymore. They haven't done it in 1,000 years, but he still puts it in here. Ritual purity, everything from the mikvah to the red heifer. Nezikim, which is a section in the Talmud. This is damages. This would be like robbery, judging issues between people, who's going to owe who. There's one on acquisition, which is kind of like a business one. There's one mishpatim, which is on civil laws. And there's one on kind of like the judges and what the judges are supposed to do. So these are, and most famously, obviously, in it is the 8 laws of tzedakah, which many of us have heard of. So those are the sections. And we're going to look at the sections now, just a little bit. We have a few minutes. But again, anytime, and it's actually, again, it's meant to be read by the people. So when you read the Mishnah Torah, it's not like reading the Guide to the Perplexed, like Carol was mentioning. It is not mind-blowing stuff where you think like, I can't understand this. It's just too much for me. It's the opposite. It's meant to be clear, concise for everybody, all men, even maybe some women should be able to understand. Obviously, women will understand it, but that was their point of view. It's meant for everybody. If you're literate, you're going to understand this. That's what it's meant. So it's a really much easier read than most things that we'll have if you're not a scholar. Obviously, if you're a scholar. So we'll go to does everybody see it? Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so what you do is you just go, I picked the Mishnah Torah. I'm going to the transmission of the oral law. I'm going to go to chapter 1. See how easy it is? Paragraph 1. Now, if you go up here and you want to read it yourself, you see where I'm pointing right here, everybody? This A. When you first get it, it's going to be like this. It's going to be Hebrew and English. So if you want to do the Hebrew, great. If you just want the English, all you have to do is go to this A and then go to this A, and all of a sudden it's just in English. So it's really pretty simple. The Rambam is the name of Maimonides. It's his acronym, Introduction to the Mishnah Torah. In the name of the God, Lord of the world, then I will not be ashamed when I gaze at your commandments. The commandments given to Moses at Mount Sinai were all given together with their explanations as implied in Exodus. And I will give you the tablets of stone, the Torah and the mitzvah. The Torah refers to the written law, the mitzvah to the explanation. God commanded us to fulfill the Torah according to the mitzvah. The mitzvah is the oral law. So he's basically saying God gave us the Bible and the oral law, the Talmud. And he's going to explain what he means by this. Moses, our teacher, personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. So what does that mean? Moses wrote down the Torah. He gave a Torah scroll to each tribe and placed another scroll and the ark as a testimonial. This is not really from the Bible. This is his interpretation. And then he says, oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Take this Torah scroll and place it beside the ark, and it will be there as a testimonial, which we still do today. We still have our Torah in the ark. The mitzvah, i.e. the explanation of the Torah, he did not transcribe. This is what we call the oral law, the Talmud. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and the totality of Israel. Using a quote. What does this mean? There is a belief. He did not invent this belief. This is what everybody believed. At Sinai, God gave the Torah to Moses. He wrote it down. God gave the Talmud to Moses. He memorized it, and he passed it on through memorization. He's just explaining it to the laity, what all the scholars believe. Number 4, even though the oral Torah is not transcribed, Moses, our teacher, taught it in its entirety in his court to the 70 elders. And then number 5, similarly, throughout his life, Joshua taught the oral law to the others. 6, Elijah received it. 7, the member of Ezra's court, he's going through the ages on how the oral law. Antigonus of Socho got it. Hillel and Shammai got it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who probably was the leader when they codified the Bible. His colleagues, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Rabban Gamliel, who was a next generation, the head of the Sanhedrin, the head rabbi. And then he continues until Rabbeinu HaKodesh, which is Judah HaNasi. He wrote the Mishnah. So basically he's saying from the moment Moses got the oral law, it was passed down all the way until somebody wrote it down. And that was Judah HaNasi. And then the rest of the stuff was written later by later people. So basically, the introduction is, this is how it works. This is how it was all passed down. The Talmud is law. And then he gives a little thing, who passes it down. Everybody see this? That's 40 generations back to Moses. So it goes backwards to Moses, how it was passed on. Who's at the very bottom? Who is going to be number 1? Moses. So it's going to get passed all the way through. Some of the people you'll know: Joshua, Eli, David, Elijah, Elisha, the Hosea, the prophetic books, Isaiah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, then to Ezra the scribe, then to these scholars, then to Gamliel, Shimon, and then who does it end up with? All the way to it's written down.
What years did it cover, all of those different people, roughly?
Rav and Shmuel right here. You see this, number 5? They're 3rd century CE. So then it goes all the way to the 6th century CE. So we're talking roughly 1250, 1300, so to 600. So we're basically talking 2,000 years.
You know, we're all familiar with the game of like telephone, where,
right,
and to communicate. This almost sounds like it, where, when you transmit a message to one person and then that person transmits it and so on, and how the message gets garbled. I mean,
That would be heretical. You were kicked out of Judaism, Larry. Goodbye. That is what we think as, but that's not how it's thought of in Jewish tradition. And we must remember they're probably more correct in some ways than we think. Because in Jewish tradition, there's always been two types of scholars. There is the scholar who disseminates the material. Those are the famous ones. Hillel, Maimonides, Judah HaNasi. But there were people who were human computers, and their job was to memorize everything exactly, because you weren't allowed to write this stuff down until the time of Judah HaNasi. And so they were human computers. Their job was memorize exactly. And that's what they did. All day long, they memorized and repeated word for word from the person. So obviously there may have been some, but there were people who basically, that was their job, was to be human computers and just remember stuff. But yes, from our perspective, again, we're from the more modern, contemporary Jewish world. We don't believe the oral law was given necessarily to Moses. Did I show you the oral law, by the way? You see those books?
Yes.
That's what they're talking about that was memorized by Moses and passed down. All 50 of those books. So so future stuff, because so obviously to us, we don't look at it that way. They do. The sages do. The more traditional. Yes, Stuart.
Two quick thoughts. One is this idea of rabbis who memorize is something that survives till today. The Lubavitcher Rebbe never wrote or worked from notes. He would give these long Farbrengens, hours long, and he had people who sat there and memorized, and then after the Farbrengen, because they were usually on a holiday or Shabbos, they wrote the whole thing.
Exactly.
In that sense, recording right from memory. So this is an old tradition.
It is, and it's an important one. Again, we don't understand how they do this because we got computers. We're not doing this anymore. But they did not have computers. There was edicts against writing any of this commentary about the Bible down on paper. It was restricted to memorization for a very long time. And so that's what their job was. I mean, your one job was to memorize. Now there's certain people who were good, like, here we have, these are the famous people who obviously wrote their own stuff and added to it. The human computers are not the ones who get their names on this page. If you're a human computer who can also create your own ideas, then you get yourself on this page. But you've got, this is, Ezra, this is Yehuda and Shimon, this is Hillel and Shammai, this is Rav and Shmuel, this is Rav Ashi. These are very, very famous people. Obviously, you probably heard of this guy named Moses. He was fairly well known as well. So these are the that's how you get shown. So what you see is he is in this part reiterating, I believe in tradition. I believe in the Talmud. I believe in the sanctity of the oral law. So he's basically saying, I'm one of you.
Just scanning the list, it looks like the only king, is David, right?
Right. David and Solomon I think Solomon is on here too, or maybe not. I thought Solomon, but you're right. Solomon's not on here. Just David, you're right.
Yeah. Second thought with this list belies the criticism that Maimonides did not include citation. Because what this list really says is that the Talmud was created by Hashem, by God.
Right.
And that was his sole creation. And he gives a list of how it was passed down. So in this sense, this is a citation of the oral Talmud until the time of Judah HaNasi.
Right, and we can look at it that way, but to this world, it's, you have to have who said this. You can't say Maimonides said this. You have to say in the name of Rav who wrote this list down. And he
Well,
did
yeah.
it.
Well, Hashem, but that's who said it.
But somebody had to
And-
write it down.
Yeah.
So that Stuart, I'm right there with you. I mean, it's a dichotomy, but that's just how it's looked at. Now, if you look at, and again, this is his introduction. This is not as big a deal because that's just the introduction. Oops, sorry.
Is there any difference between rabbi and rav? They use the word rav a lot, I see there. Is that a title for a rabbi or?
No, it's just the designation depends on where you're living. Rav means you're living in what is Babylonia.
Oh.
And
A
rabbi
rav
would
would be a
be
rabbi in Babylonia then?
exactly.
Oh.
Or probably Iran, Iraq, and rabbi is. Remember, a lot of these names are not given in the time period. You know, like Hillel was not called Rabbi Hillel during his lifetime because the term rabbi was not used yet. So it is used going backwards in time. Now, Rav, by the time of Rav, they are called Rav in their time period. And then they eventually are called Rabbi in their time period. But in the first century, you wouldn't have said Rabbi Hillel. That wasn't the moniker they used. Now, let's look at the Mishnah Torah itself. Okay, we're going to go to Sefer Madah. Now, that is the first one. All right, so let's look at, it talks about the foundations of Torah. Very simple. You go back. Here's Sefer Madah, Foundations of Torah, chapter 1. That's very simple. Let's see if this is easy to understand. The foundations of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence. All the beings of heavens, earth, and what is between came into existence only from the truth of his being. This is not the Guide to Perplex where he tries to explain how God did it. This is just kind of like explaining there is a God. If one would imagine that he does not exist, no other being could possibly exist. If one would imagine that none of the entities aside from him exist, he alone would continue to exist. So basically, God does not need this, and the nullification of their existence would not nullify his existence. If we disappeared if humanity died out and the sun disappears, God's still there. So this is just what he's saying. There is one God. He is not two or more, but one unified in a manner. But he doesn't explain where he's coming from. You see, there's no citation of where this comes from. But this is not, for us, hard to understand. Most people who are Jewish, who have just a little bit of background, will understand most of this. Let's go to chapter 2, see if it's more difficult. It is a mitzvah to love and fear the glorious and awesome God. It's a commandment to fear God or be in awe of God. What is this path to love and fear? When a person contemplates his wondrous and great deeds and creations, appreciates his infinite wisdom that surpasses all comparison, he will immediately love and praise and glorify. So if you think about God and glorify God, you're doing what you're supposed to do. So we're going to end here. I had somebody in the chat, sorry. So as you can see, and we can study more about it later, but it's beautiful stuff and it's revolutionary in what he did to bring the Talmud and take away the discussion. The discussion is what's so complicated, and just say, here's the answer. And again, if he had put the citations, who knows if it wouldn't be the Shulchan Aruch today. It may not. Again, he was still controversial in many respects, but who knows what it would have become. But it's still a monumental source and essential to the Jewish world. So that's the Mishnah Torah.
Wow.
In a nutshell, we can study it more if we'd like, no worries. But let's go over what we're planning to do next week. Oops.
Mhm.
We're planning to do, I think, witchcraft, right? Or
Yes.
we're planning to do the famous people we mentioned. Let's see what we put, and we can do either. So next week I have on the list to do witchcraft. Yes, witchcraft next week, and then starting in January we're going to start talking about individuals, I think. So, any questions before we conclude?
Not a question, but just a final comment.
Please.
We were at Saturday services, which the rabbi gave a really interesting talk on the history of Hanukkah and the meanings of Hanukkah, which were very, very interesting, and how it evolved into the Festival of Lights, and it's a minor holiday in Israel compared to, the major holidays. And just coincident with that, there was an article that came out, I think it was in Aish, AISH, which you could probably find online. But they took the opposite opinion now, that they were, and actually the title of the article is something about what Hamas can learn from Hanukkah about Jewish heroes and Jewish warriors and things of that nature. And
That does sound interesting.
So I mean, they are kind of resurrecting it, not as a light candle lighting thing, but as a Jewish pride in arms and in fighting and things.
Yeah, and the competition between the rabbis and the Maccabees, or the dissension, that's disappeared by now. It's been 2,000 years. The rabbis went out, the Pharisees won, the Sadducees lose. So it's not a major holiday, but it's still, especially with the advent of Israel, an important one, because it talks about this military victory. It talks about the power of God. So yeah, there's not this,
it was a great history lesson. It was a great history lesson that the rabbi.
It is. It's really interesting.
And you can find it on YouTube, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think it'd be great. And also because Hanukkah is it's a new holiday. It's only 2,100 years old. So because of that, we have sources beyond the Bible. Of course, the Bible, it's not in the Bibles, but sources beyond the two books of the Maccabees. So that's awesome. I hope everyone has a wonderful last 2 nights and 2.5 days of Hanukkah. I hope everybody got to go to at least a Hanukkah party, or have a latke, or have some gelt, or spin a dreidel, or have a jelly donut. And we wish everyone all the best. And we will see you this weekend. We have regular services after all the Hanukkah stuff. I think we're going to just have regular short service Friday and Saturday, and then we'll have the service the next weekend, which is usually bigger because a lot of people come in town for the Christmas weekend. So, all right, guys, you guys have a wonderful weekend. Anything you need, let me know. And please join us next week, same time, same bad channel, for the study class, the Wednesday study class that shall not be named. So guys,
Thank you.
Thank you
happy
so much.
holidays.